future that might be
Yeah, I was on the team that went through the survey last year, along with Fanta, Nicole, Kozo,
Andieni
Diego,
Specos.
Cobb, a few other people. And then also sat on this year's to give a little bit of the perspective of what we did last year. So just on a very high level, as Matt pointed out, last year we had a very high response rate, I think it was at 88%. We also had an extraordinary number of comments last year. There were, on average, maybe 10 to 15 comments. So last year what we did as the review team was we split up different groups of questions. And different members of the review 45 question review all the comments to those questions. So we then created a list of companies data that actually represent what you're seeing in the qualitative comments. And we bucketed those into four major categories, which you'll see here. That ALA should make more effort to treasure people, compensate people, communicate with people, and hold people accountable. And I won't go into all the sub-bullets between those there. So that was the review team last year. And then this year, the review team really wanted to focus more specifically on quantitative metrics. There was also a much smaller amount of comments per question this year. So that was just a little bit of a contrast between the approach to each year. I'll hand that.
I think it was 264 comments last year, and this year was down to like under 180, 185 comments this year. So many fewer kind of those qualitative comments. Okay, Tanato, let's take a look at some of the data.
Can people see the text in the back? Okay. It's a little bit hard to see, but you do have this PowerPoint in your... If you're really struggling, please move forward so you can see a little bit better. But you do have this in PDF form in the invite to this meeting. So there's 35 questions in the entire survey. And what we tried to do was look at the different questions and see where there were significant changes with each question, particularly where there was more than a 5% increase or decrease in a particular question. So the ones you see at the top in green are where there was a positive movement, where either people strongly agreed or agreed with whatever the question was. So we see here that, for example, more people, about 13%, relatively more people, are finding that they have more work-life balance as compared to last year. It's still a relatively low number overall, but there is a jump from last year. There's also just a lot of talk about individuals receiving feedback and having more development conversations. So relative to last year, we do have more people also noting that they are getting more feedback on the work that they're doing at ALA. And then at the bottom, that's a red flag for question 11, which is, ALA, the atmosphere at ALA is socially friendly and welcoming. You see there's a drop of about 14%. That group of people, a lot of people tended to go towards the neutral option. So most of them did not go to strongly disagree, but a big chunk of that group of people actually moved towards just neutral. But otherwise, relative to other questions, this one is actually still really high. As Matthew mentioned, you guys will have the full set of data for this year in terms of the raw comments from individuals, but also the actual percentages. This slide talks about where there was a jump in people either disagreeing or strongly disagreeing with specific questions. So for those in the back, the biggest one up there is my colleagues embody the values of this organization, and the relative number went up by just over 5%. And then we also have some themes around conflict resolution as well. So this slide is really interesting because it combines the average of all the faculty surveys we've had historically since the 2013 one. And we saw three key themes coming out of this in terms of areas of real improvement that we need as an institution. So as mentioned earlier, first of all, work-life balance is quite low. So you see the second question there, question 15. I believe I have a sustainable work-life balance at ALA. Although it's relatively higher than last year, you can see that it is percentage-wise of those that agree is only just under 40%, and then disagree is around the same as well. So the way these questions were chosen, or at least these themes were chosen, was looking at how much of a significant change has happened over the years. So either we marked questions where there was either questions where there was a larger than 20% disagreement rate, or if there was less than a 60% agreement rate for a specific question. So these are questions that we flagged as important areas for the leadership of the academy to also take note of. So another sort of theme that came out of this was conflict resolution. That's something that needs to be improved upon. And then organizational decision-making process. So the next slides will talk a little bit more about the different themes that we have categorized within the entire survey, and then some recommendations. Oh, so this is just some commentary on some of the questions I just highlighted from the previous survey. They're a little bit hard to see, and I won't go through each one individually, but you will have all the raw data and all the raw commentary from people on this slide as well.
Thanks, Tanacho. So as Tanacho mentioned, the next few slides are going to talk about themes. So what we did, which we hope is a step forward from last year as well, we wanted to actually cluster the 30 plus questions that are in the survey into 6 themes, some of which really fit nicely together, some of which we tried to sort of make sure that we had fewer themes, because at the end of the day, it's really important to have a dashboard of themes that help us track towards progress over the course of the organization's history. So we actually came up with 6 themes. One is communication, and the 4 questions that relate to that you can see in your PDF. It's hard to see here, but it's much more about being clear about the goals, things being communicated to you quite easily and well. The second bucket is community. Here, there's some that are relatively loosely gathered together within this bucket, but effectively it's about living and working at ALA, or working with your colleagues and feeling in an environment that's friendly and welcoming, etc. There's a relatively big bucket called feedback, performance, PD, and growth, which is about receiving feedback, how you're assessed in terms of performance, the culture of the organization, the level of support that your manager gives you, EXCO gives you, etc. There's leadership and accountability, which is very much about the leaders of the organization and how people view leadership, and how you also view people within the organization, such as your peers, in terms of how they're accountable, whether to each other or to their values. Purpose, which is a little bit broad and rather philosophical, but it's about work being meaningful, enjoying working at ALA, etc., being proud to be a part of ALA. And the last one is work-life balance, which kind of stands out on its own. One of the things that we also identified as PCOM as a potential for this to be explored further, maybe with additional questions in future surveys. So I'll just present briefly 4 years worth of data for the data that is available across each of those themes. So if you look at, it's arranged chronologically, with purple being the oldest survey that we have data for on each of those themes, and blue being the most recent data. And what we did was we basically took all of the data and summarized it for a given theme, just to give you a snapshot of where we are within each theme. So as you can see, communication and consistency, I've given red arrows, which is relatively slight downward trends since the first survey that we have data for, which is 2013. But even that, it's not a huge dip necessarily. But the 4 areas of positive growth with the green arrows pointing upwards, you see a slight upward trend. And you'll see, obviously, there's huge differences, right? So purpose, for example, there's a big spike in 2014, dropped down a little bit after that. And then with work-life balance, as Tinacha, I think, mentioned before, even though there's a positive uptick, it's starting from a very low baseline. So yes, we're making progress, but there's still a lot of room for improvement. So key things to note here is positive trends upwards in feedback, work-life balance, leadership accountability, and a slight downward trend in the first two. So we go to the next one. This is the chart for overall disagreement. You'll notice that the axis is slightly different. It's just to accommodate the scale for where most of the responses lie. So in general, there's far fewer disagreement, which is a good thing in and of itself, because disagreement in what it measures in the survey is a negative outcome. So you'll notice that the arrows are a little bit counterintuitive. So just to give you clarity on what the arrows mean, disagreement is a negative outcome. So increasing disagreement is a red arrow, all right? Even though it's going up. And decreasing disagreement is a green arrow, even though the arrow is going down. So again, not all of this mirrors, not all of this mirrors what you saw in the previous slide, but some of it seems to make sense. There's up sort of positive movement in feedback and performance, work-life balance and community, whereas leadership, accountability, purpose and communication, this slight downward trend in terms of disagreement. So we thought this was helpful because this is the first time we've actually done trend analysis over the years, because we think that it's helpful for us to showcase this as a mini dashboard for the health of the organization when it comes to people issues that you can actually look at from an ongoing basis year to year and see where the real problem areas are. Trends and overall agreement worth noting. So this is something that we pulled specifically in terms of each question for over 4 years. Decreasing areas of agreement is the first 5 questions. So basically these questions, there's a slight downward trend. So I feel appreciated for the work I do at ALA. Conflict, which Tinacho mentioned as well. Working at ALA, overall I enjoy working at ALA, and then feeling included, as well as being socially friendly and welcoming. So slight downward trends there, which is something to note, and I think Ayada will talk about some recommendations there. And then the last 2, sustainable work-life balance and feedback on performance. As mentioned, the first of which is a relatively low baseline, and the second, but it's something to really note and actually be happy about, because I think feedback improving is a great thing for the organization overall. So I'm going to hand it to Ayada.
Hi, everyone. So I think one of the recommendations, or some of the recommendations that we as PCOM think should be addressed are focusing on long-term concerns that have, from the trend analysis that Shami has just spoken about, focusing on addressing some of those issues. So just to help the people at the back. So the first one was question 13. I can voice concerns about decisions made at ALA without fear of retribution, so addressing that. I believe I have a sustainable work-life balance at ALA. It has been a long, ongoing issue, so addressing that as well. I have confidence in the process by which major decisions are made in this organization. I think that goes under leadership. And then conflicts also. Conflicts are addressed and constructively resolved in this organization. So looking at those trends has been very helpful in understanding what the trends have been over the years, and we recommend this being addressed. And also celebrating or capitalizing on some of the positive trends. So, for example, there has been an increase in people reporting that they receive frequent feedback on their performance, celebrating managers responsible for that as well, for this feedback. And also, regardless of the fact that there's a low baseline for the work-life balance, there are people who reported that they're able to achieve work-life balance. So hearing from those people would be really helpful, and trying and getting some of those interventions for ourselves across different departments is a recommendation that we would like to have. And then also alluding to the fact that we've created this almost trend or this dashboard, how would that be helpful for us as PCOM currently, and also for the other PCOMs coming over the years? Using that would be really helpful. And then another recommendation is breaking down these responses across different divisions and departments in order to help ExCo, HR, and even managers to come up with tangible interventions for each and every department. And yeah, we'll speak more about that. But yeah, thanks.
So that's our kind of summary of our analysis that we've done and that we wanted to share with the community. which is what we were asked to do. And then we wanted to open it up to questions, either for PCOM about how we chose to analyze the results and move forward with those, or questions for either Hatem or Lara, who are here from Mexico. Comments or questions? Yeah. Great. So PCOM doesn't know that. We advise and recommend on that. Our job was really to pick those concerns out of the data doing a 4-year analysis, was to say, hey, look, here's what we see looking at 4 years, and this is what we recommend the organization work on. And so that's really our task and our challenge to EXCO and all of us organizationally to address those pieces. Does that help? So I don't have any explicit, we're not saying do X, Y, Z. We're saying here are the areas where we would recommend focusing. Thank you. Lara.
No, thanks. I can answer that just slightly clearer. And so what we would do for those questions, just because they've been trending for a long time, is that we'll probably pick about 2 or 3 of them that we want to work on next year. And let's just say work-life balance is one of the ones that we want to pick. Just like we kind of focused a lot on performance review this year. We really did a lot of things on PD. We did a lot of things on training managers on how to give feedback and to make sure like feedback is more consistent. We have to deliberately focus on those areas, because when they've been trending for so long, it's not because we're not working on them. It's because whatever interventions that we have instituted over the years has not worked. So what we've done this year is that we focus on 2 things: recruitment and performance review from an HR perspective. So next year, we'll probably focus on 1 or 2 things so that we can have that laser focus approach to some of these things that have been trending for a long time. And if I had to pick out of this 4, it would be definitely the first one, because it's something that as ESCO we've never really understood. We've always felt like most of us have an open door, and we need that to be fixed. So that would be one of them, for sure. And then as a community, we can pick 1 or 2 more that we can focus on and we can work on as a community.
Other questions? Yeah, Divine. So Divine asks a great question. He asks, really, how much can we read into these longitudinal analyses without breaking it down further into how long a particular colleague has been at the organization or within division and department. And from PCOM's standpoint, we would agree there, and we do think that this is just kind of the beginning top tier level of analyses, and that was really what we wanted to get started. But we would say that, yeah, you can mine even further into this to look at trends for our newest employees, trends for our most senior employees, et cetera. So that would be my response to that.
And thanks, Matthew. I think in addition to that, I'd add that, yes, you probably can't pick out too much. This is just broad trends. And I think it's helpful because it still gives a high-level picture, but it also points to the need to actually fill out the survey every year, because you do need a robust set of data So I think one of the things that we were kind of also surprised at in terms of the lack of response, I think it's really important that everyone takes this seriously. So we do have comparable data sets every year. So what we are suggesting, this is by no means a definitive thing, but it gives you a picture of what it could be to look at the people indicators for the organization. And then you could also, by filling out the survey much more diligently, I think year after year, then have a much more robust view that you could compare things to. So it's just a baseline to help us make informed decisions on areas that might need improvement consistently.
Dilyana and then David. I'll bring you the mic.
Well, first of all, thanks to PCOM for the great work on the survey. I think it's very helpful to see the trends across the years, at least at a high level, obviously with some suggestions to be incorporated in the future. What I would have loved to see, and maybe it's something that we can consider doing in the next couple of weeks, is a good deep dive of this year, right? Because even though we have a clear indication of how certain topics have moved over the years, it's not necessarily easy if you look at the current version of the analysis to say, well, these are the top areas where we excelled this year, because an average score, and I'll talk about the methodology in a second, but an average score of 4 was achieved across these 4 or 5 categories. And similarly, we only achieved an average score of 2 for these bottom 3 categories. So that's something that I'd love to see in maybe a deeper level analysis or something along this front. And then the second point which I wanted to make is that the current methodology, again, is very useful for the trends across agreement and disagreement, but what it seems to be missing is that middle group of people who were neutral. And I can see that there's a decent chunk of that group in quite a few of the categories, and ignoring them may not be the most robust way to approach the analysis. So those are my 2 suggestions, if we can take, along with Divine's recommendation on the analysis, to take this specific set of responses to a next step.
Great suggestions. Thank you for that. Further dive into the current data that we have. David.
I was just curious, to piggyback on Divine's question, you mentioned we were going to get the raw data, right? Would we be able to run that analysis ourselves if we were interested? Do we have that information?
Absolutely, you certainly can. You'll have everything but names.
Yeah, sure, just for this year.
Just on that, the data from 2013, 2014 had to be extrapolated from a result. We didn't have the actual raw numbers, so we extrapolated from a similar presentation like this. Great. Other questions? Yep, sorry, Joanne. I would say you're right. It becomes harder and harder without those particular data points. It certainly does. Again, if you are interested in doing that level of analysis with the data that we do have, by all means feel free, and that could be helpful. But you're right. Without having some of those demographic questions answered, it becomes harder and harder to understand and interpret the data for a particular group. Yeah.
The data to actually do something, and I think that's the trade-off that you as respondents have to make, I think. So it's your choice to actually fill in that data to say, am I feeding this information? And if it's that uncomfortable for you to actually fill out demographic information, you should. Right? It's entirely up to you because the level of information that you give the data or the survey rather is what is actually useful. So I think it is up to you, and I think it's up to the level of the comfort that the respondents feel. But I think we wouldn't want to force anything in terms of demographic questions.
Knows the indicators, because one of the first things I told Chami when I walked in here is that when Matthew announced that they were going to send the data out, when I was reading the data, I could tell who some people were. So the first question I asked is, are you going to take the division or the department out? Because when only one person fills out the data, or somebody's senior management and is in this division, and then there's only one senior manager in some departments, yeah. So I think we can't just give the data out as is. So I would suggest that we give it to an external person to mine the data.
Logistically, we don't ask that question, are you doing well on the performance review?
Yeah, there's no performance plan to it.
We'll make it happen. There are a lot of different analyses you can do with this. You bet, absolutely. And our statistics class could maybe do a good job of that as well. But great. Other questions, comments that we want to address today? Yes.
Can you have a large mic? You should use the mic.
I'm just a bit unclear because there's a lot of mention of data and extrapolating data and what it means and information. And then based on the information that has been gathered over the years with these long-term concerns and the failure, I think that Laura mentioned, of EXCO to actually resolve or find working solutions, then I think it gets to a point where it's like, why provide the data if I've provided this data but there's no solution? I'm just not getting it. And then there's more calls for data, but what's happening with it? And what's the gap between the interventions that EXCO has suggested or tried to implement and people actually feeling like something's being done? I hope my question makes sense.
For this year on performance and feedback, it sounds like that's an intervention that was applied based on feedback or based on people's responses to the survey that's creating a better working environment. So I think that could be just one specific example based on this survey. So I'm saying that the past 4 years, that's one of the most positive trends has been how people feel about whether they're receiving enough development and feedback to do PD, right? And that's one of the focuses over the past year. So it seems to me that's responding to a consistent concern with specific actions and policies that are having a meaningful effect on people's work and their working life at ALA. So that's one. And I would say, I think what Lara was suggesting is now we've identified the 4 key problems, or I say PCOM is suggesting 4 things to look into, and there might be specific responses for those as well.
And understand that our analysis was based on relative numbers. So it isn't necessarily that we're these survey results are indicating a lower agreement rate or a higher disagreement rate, so that's where we would recommend spending on these surveys.
Okay, just to be very transparent, one, there's sometimes that we're working on very tough issues. I'll use an example, compensation. And the answer is not a 1 month or a 3 month solution. And maybe we've not done very well in terms of, okay, where we're at and how far it would take us to get there. But definitely, when we see a trend each year, we do address it. What I was saying earlier was that sometimes whatever intervention that we put in place doesn't actually shift it out, and that means that we have to start again, or we have to take a different direction. And those are normal in an environment like this. I mean, we just have to keep working at it. So the good thing about this performance review is that we want to make sure that we continue so that we don't have to deal with it again 2 years from now. So that's another problem. So we've done a lot of work in 2016-17. A bad place to find ourselves is like in 2018-19 or 2021, that becomes a very low survey score again, and we have to deal with it again. And those are all the kind of things we have to deal with. Sometimes things come back, they show up again because everybody relaxes. And sometimes it just takes longer than a year or a few months to solve some of these problems.
Well, please, if you have,
Dave.
all right, last question.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. So I think the interesting thing about last year's data, so there were a lot of the action steps, I think, in the first slide were actually drawn more from the comments necessarily than the actual data. So we're actually suggesting that this is, especially based on 4 years analysis of data as well, that these are consistent problem areas, and we're suggesting these 4 long-term concerns be addressed, and that's the recommendation we're giving to, for example, EXCO and HR. So that's what we're suggesting. We're not necessarily saying that these are the action steps you take to address them. That's a longer term discussion. And I mean, I think EXCO will be engaging PCOM on that in the weeks to come. But this is just based on the data. So one of the things that we saw also in last year's analysis was that a lot of extrapolation was actually made based on the data, where we wanted to actually present the data, have you interpret it, and see it for yourselves, and then have a deliberation on how we actually proceed from that. So does that answer your question? I mean, these are problem areas. They're not necessarily action steps. And I think that's back to, Kosi, your question, I think, as well. So do you have a follow-up? So it's a suggestion that we're making, yes. I mean, so there's some areas that are also like, for example, negative trends based on last year alone, for example, like the feeling welcome and inclusive and diverse communities, etc. Just to give you complete clarity and honesty, I mean, there's no question on the survey on compensation at all, right? So it's hard for us to then make a recommendation on compensation without data from the survey that actually suggests that. There are points in the survey qualitative feedback that allude to that, but the data alone doesn't actually suggest anything that needs to be addressed. However, HR and EXCO know that compensation is a huge priority in terms of banding, etc., for the next year and a half. So what we're saying is this is the data from the staff survey. There could be also another suggestion to include questions on that in the survey for the future. This is part of kind of ongoing discussions. But what we wanted to actually do is stay faithful to the survey and the data so that we can actually suggest, okay, these are problem areas. So if you have any suggestions and different reads of the data, please reach out to us, because I don't think we're not saying this is gospel by any means. So we'd love to actually, we can inputs and suggestions when we do send out this. So I'm going to ask Lara to actually weigh in, but my perspective, this is just my personal perspective, these are organizational culture questions rather than pain points for the academy from an HR and people perspective alone. That doesn't mean we shouldn't include questions on compensation in the future, but as you know, 35 questions, not a single question on compensation, right? So that's something we could explore for the future, but this, in my view, is like an organizational culture barometer, so to speak. There are many things that it surfaces, many things that it doesn't, and maybe that's something we look at for future surveys. But I know that, you know, compensation is top of mind for Lara as well, so I'd ask her to just weigh in on that.
So I think last year, I mean, we all had a tough year, and that was just very vivid in people's mind. And so even though the question did not ask for that, a lot of people actually talked about that. So that's why I'm bringing it up, because it's one of those things that I don't think we've found a solution to yet, because of the time it would take us to fix the things that we need to fix. And obviously everybody knows that we've not had an HR director for a few months now, almost a year actually, since Vaish left. So one of the first things we have to do that, that project would be to hire a head of HR. Because right now, the work-life balance, everything comes in a cycle. Just everybody's swamped. If you go to Ovire, he's swamped, Lara is swamped. So unless we have that person in place, we can't do that project to the extent that we should do it. We've tried to use temporary resource for it, and we just didn't get the full spectrum of the problem. So we're not bypassing it. I think we just have to communicate that it's still in the works, and it's going to take longer than we expected. But it's actually interesting because that didn't come up as much this year. So it's also what people are dealing with at different times.
That actually interesting. When you do the comments, there were significant relatively fewer comments on compensation this year than last year. They were there, I'm sure, but relatively fewer.
All right, the faces are not very. So do you want to make comments? Everybody just looks down and.
I can try. I imagine. I am a very inexperienced manager, and I definitely learned a lot in the last 6 months. I think we are a very young organization, and a lot of our managers are new, and I think it's a feature of the organizational maturity. Maybe ALA 10 years from now will have a very different degree of capacity across the board for managers. I don't have a specific date, though, at which point all managers will be really good at managing. I do think, though, that is, I mean, not to call anyone out by name, but I know there's a couple of members on EXCO who think that doing manager training is one of the biggest gaps that the Academy has. And I know that I've had several conversations about it, but I'm sorry that I can't say that there's a specific day for when we'll launch manager training in a more formal way, but it's a point of concern. But I suppose what I wanted to, the main thing is to say this is a very young organization. It's not entirely surprising that there's a lot of people managing others who don't have as much experience as we'd like.
We'll take two more. Let's take Vincent, we haven't heard from, and
I think the reality of the fact is that the idea of leadership and management sometimes, for me, I know I tend to lean toward management, and you will be told we need leaders, not managers, and that becomes a conflict. So some of us, some people tend to now try to learn to lead and less to manage. Thank you.
Hi. Sorry, my question is just on number 22, the conflicts that are addressed constructively. What happens then if these conflicts are addressed for and everything works out well for 2 weeks, but then the same conflicts with the same people arise again and it's an issue that keeps going on? How then do we get to have it constructively resolved and not to keep occurring?
thank you all very much for your time. If you'd like to dive into some of the data, you may. Thank you for your continued support of PCOM. Appreciate it.
Thank you.